Our world has so many needs, and when you want to make a difference in the world and do some good things, it can be hard to know where to focus. Should you deal with the big global issues with some advocacy or policy work? Or should you deal with local issues with hands-on work in your community? Either is fine, or you could do both, like today's guest, Orion Kriegman of the Boston Food Forest Coalition. He used to work for several years on those big international issues, and now he's working to revitalize urban neighborhoods by introducing nature, helping people grow food, strengthening community. So the global and the local, it's all connected, and it's all interesting. This is a really fascinating conversation today. Let's dig in. This is the joy of saving the human race, where we try to get the world to cooperate. It's so the human race can avoid some urgent global problems that could mean the end of civilization and cause lots of suffering around the world. But also, we just want to have a good world that we enjoy and we can feel proud of. We are not just citizens of our own countries, we are citizens of the human race. Let's learn to manage ourselves responsibly. Let's help the human race act like it wants to last for a while. I think humans are awesome, and the human race is worth saving. There is no time to waste, so let's do this. Hi friends, welcome to the joy of saving the human race. I'm Shelby Murtis. Thanks for joining me. So before we begin, I want to let you know that this show is available in a bunch of different places. On YouTube, Spotify, and most podcast players, because I want it to be convenient for you, so that you have a lot of choices. Wherever you listen to this, I would be grateful if you would hit all those good buttons, like the like and the subscribe and the share and give it a rating and any of that good stuff you wish. If you subscribe, that helps you know when new episodes come out, and we can stay in touch that way. And also, as you like it and rate it and all that good stuff, it lets other people know about the show. And this is not just a show, it's a growing movement where we try to push for strong global solutions to fix some of these big global problems that face humanity. So I would appreciate your help with all that stuff. So today, I'm really excited about this conversation we're going to have. We're here talking with Orion Kriegman, who is Executive Director of the Boston Food Forest Coalition. Orion, welcome to the show.
Hi, Shelby.
Yeah, good to have you with us. So we have talked a little bit in the past about your interesting professional life and the path that you've been on. What I have found interesting about it is that you have encompassed some work with these really big global issues, and then also now doing work that's very local and hands-on. And I don't know if I've met anyone who has sort of transcended the really big and the local, in one life. So I find it interesting. Orion used to work for the Tellus Institute, which deals with some of the large global issues facing humanity that affect our future, with some analytics and forecasting and visioning about what the future might look like, which could be really big and great, or it could be kind of horrendous if we're not careful, and some of the things we need to be paying attention to. And then also now is working in Boston, Massachusetts for the Boston Food Forest Coalition, basically reintroducing nature to some urban neighborhoods and helping people grow food and revitalizing neighborhoods, which is just pretty cool. And we'll hear about that too. So why don't we start by, you could tell us about Tellus and, the Tellus Institute and just what that is and what you did there, if you could.
Sure. Tellus Institute has a long history, and a lot of what it accomplished over its history happened long before I arrived. And it started with a different name even, and sort of back in the 70s, and largely tracks the emergence of the whole field of sustainable development and thinking about sustainability on a global level. And a lot of the attention it got over the years was for some work it did with the United Nations, where it helped convene the Global Scenarios Group. And it ran several scenario studies about the trajectory of global development under different assumptions, and crunched those numbers and published those in a series of reports. And one of its scenarios was the optimistic scenario, the best case scenario. So it looked at the notion of extreme inequality rising and polarization deepening, and global development being unsuccessful, and poverty and inequality being part of like a global apartheid. So that was like one possible outcome from the present day. Another possible outcome it looked at was like market forces being triumphant, and technology full of innovations and all sorts of good surprises, and what that scenario might look like. Another one it looked at was policy reform, sort of like intelligent global policies being enacted either through the United Nations or some form of global democracy, and having that ripple down to national levels, and sort of basically a global social democracy emerging. But the Great Transition scenario basically was, the assumption is that humanity makes a civilizational transformation and shift towards what we would think of as justice, but thinking specifically about like, what does it mean to really realign human civilization with natural systems and be in harmony with nature and live on Earth in a sustainable way, in a balanced way. And what does that actually mean in terms of the economic transformations, political transformations, cultural transformations, educational transformations, like really thinking about the whole gambit of what that change would look like and how might we imagine it. So we did a lot of different thought pieces while I was there within what became known as the Great Transition Initiative, which was a network of global scholars and activists that I coordinated through discussions and research papers. And a large part of it was asking this question, like, how do we get from the world we are today to this vision, this beacon of a great transition? Like, what is the pathway? And what does that look like? And how might we imagine it? And so people took different stabs at it, and there's real vigorous debate about some of these ideas. And it was very intellectually formative and fascinating and wide-ranging. And I spent a lot of time talking with folks about climate change, because the Tellus Institute, they were involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on the IPCC reports. They were authors on those reports. So when Al Gore won his Nobel Peace Prize, the IPCC report also won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so by extension, so did the scientists working at the Tellus Institute. And so we would have a lot of conversations about climate change. And this was back in the early 2000s, when it really wasn't even on the policy radar on a national level. This was like just barely breaking through, with Al Gore doing some tour of his PowerPoint presentation as a movie. And people were like, oh yeah, change our light bulbs. It was like just sort of the cusp of the conversation. And I remember at one point, like we had visitors from the Environmental Protection Agency like come through and do a little talk with us at a brown bag lunch. And it was informative. It was like they said, yeah, everything related to climate change has to go through the vice president's office and get redacted. I was like, whoa, that's weird. That's not the country I thought I lived in.
Right. Yeah, you'd expect that in the CIA or the Defense Department,
right.
Not like climate change. Yeah.
That was back when Dick Cheney was, in charge of things. So anyway, it was like, so that was eye-opening for me to like be part of those conversations, to be thinking about the big policy implications of climate change. By the time Obama swooped in and the Paris Accords were created, like in my mind, we were already up against the wall at that point, based on what I had learned at the Tellus Institute. So in my mind, like the Paris pledges were like too little too late, and of course we're not even like close to achieving those. So it's like the whole thing feels very bleak. At some core level that was true back then. Like we knew it all back then. We, you know, it just wasn't part of the conversation yet. But I think one of the things that I really got from the Tellus Institute is that the rational basis for hope is actually in the simple fact that nobody can predict the future. You know, the future is fundamentally unknowable. Surprise is baked into this universe. You know, like there's many examples where you can't predict what's going to happen from the constituent parts that make something up. Like you can't predict the properties of water by studying the properties of oxygen or hydrogen. Something completely novel emerges when you combine them. And we could not have told you it was going to be there. And that happens again and again. And so the future is fundamentally unknowable. Another reason is because, you know, if you believe in free will and human agency, the future is made up of choices that we've yet to make. So the future is not someplace we're going to. It's something we're creating through our choices by joining together with other people. So even if it's improbable, even if this great transition scenario feels very unlikely, I think the simple point is that it's technically possible. It's achievable in a hard numbers if you crunch the numbers sort of way. And that's kind of what the message of the Tellus Institute was. And therefore, it's probably worth fighting for, or trying to like pull the gravitational force of civilization in that direction, like make that our beacon that we aim towards. Even if we fall short of it, we'll be better. We'll be far better off than we would have otherwise.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting what you say about free will and that nobody can know the future. And I think about this a lot because I get frustrated sometimes in public conversations where it seems to be a debate between optimists and pessimists. And people are making these predictions like, yes, this is going to happen. This good thing future is going to happen, or this bad future is going to happen. And I get tired of predictions because really nobody knows. And it depends what we do. So, I mean, something I value about Tellus Institute is that it's not only crunching numbers and putting out scientific reports, which is all great and important, obviously, but there's this imagination process that's necessary for people to try to get a handle on where we're headed and what our choices are. And I feel like us using our imaginations in a grounded way is just critical. You can't make a future unless you can envision it first and work toward it. So it must have been interesting to be right there in the middle of these conversations that are both scientific, but also using your imaginations. It seems kind of unique compared to others out there.
Yeah, it was incredibly intellectual. It was incredibly like imaginative. It was a real invitation to sort of play with some radical, ambitious ideas. You know, like one of the questions we continue to ask is like, what is global democracy? Like, what is, like when you have transnational corporations that have power, enough power to play national governments against themselves in the sort of race to the bottom and lowering of environmental standards and labor standards and all sorts of things. And these transnational corporations can free up the movement of capital, you know, even as humans can't move to where the jobs are now created because of immigration restrictions. But like you have this whole situation where what's the proper level of governance over these organizations? I mean, there's no existing governance. It's a free-for-all. And so like on a national level, we kind of worked out a model. It's not perfect. It's been argued about. It continues to be, you know, challenged intellectually, but like it's the notion of sort of like the welfare state or social democracy in Europe as it's been formed, you know, it largely works to provide health and wealth to people and a minimum floor for most of folks, and, you know, literacy and like, so it's like, it's not utopia, but it's not a disaster. And the capacity to extend a version of that to the globe is real. Like, it's not unimaginable that you could have national standards around health and access to healthcare and labor laws and safety and environmental standards be applied across the globe. and distribute resources more evenly through taxation and other things that we do on a national level all the time. So it's like, what are the obstacles to that? Like, why do people fear the phrase global government is such a feared concept, right? So like the questions of like, what are the social dynamics and the psychological dynamics at play? And like, what is the technical challenge there? And what are some of the models that people have attempted or tried, or, you know, like, and pulling that, all that into a conversation and trying to digest it and come up with some insights as to like, that was great. That was fun. Like I at that time in my life, I worked with a bunch of academic folk, and we wrote a paper about the potential of a real movement of global citizens, you know, saying that we are part of one Earth nation. You know, we prefigure it. We demand to be part of it because we believe in it, because we identify with it. Like, what would it take for such a movement to really emerge, and the solidarity that would require, and how might racism and all the intersectional things that get exploited in left-wing social movement fermenting, where like people are separated and have a very hard time coming together. And even the concept of a shared vision is like not something that followers of Michael Foucault would even want to buy into. It's like there's a whole vision around being divided. It's like crazy, the left, right? So like, what does it mean to sort of have a progressive global citizens movement? You know, so that was a fun paper. So I remember that was fun for me too, because it was like, I think the only academic paper I've ever published in my career. And it was, you know, presented at a conference with other academics and critiqued by academics. And it was kind of a fun, you know, it's fun to be thinking on that level. Gave me a little taste of what it might have been to be a professor, maybe.
Right. Yeah. So these massive, I mean, the changes we as a civilization need to make are pretty massive. Like, we need a lot of things to change all at the same time at all levels of government in all countries, and it's a cultural thing too. I mean, as you guys did that study, are there some of the top levers we can pull to make this happen, or some particular areas where we should all be focused on to try to get the changes we need?
You mean,
I know it's a massive question, but
yeah, it's a massive question. I think, I mean, I feel really humble. I don't know that I have answers to these questions. I have lots of like thoughts about pieces of these, but it's, having been at the Tellus Institute really reinforced for me how hard it is to reconcile some core values and key insights across disciplines, and really help, you know, get people on the same page about a shared vision that people feel good about. I mean, that's a very tall order. And I don't know that the Great Transition Initiative ever really achieved that. I think it achieved robust discussion, though, which was pretty like rigorous conversation around some of the complexities of that. I guess I don't know, for a global citizens movement, I don't know that I do understand what would usher that into existence. I think the concept that we worked with at the time is that it's kind of latent. It exists in our imaginations, and some people already identify with it, you know, even though it's not been called into existence in a very broad way. And some people are writing and thinking about it, and the languaging on it is diverse, you know, not just across all the languages of the world, but also within the English language, it's diverse. You know, it's like there's just, people haven't centered around core framing. But I do think like human rights, I think focusing on human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and sort of the ancillary documents that came out of the struggles of prior generations, like the Earth Charter, I think those documents, rescuing them from oblivion and obscurity and holding them up as, you know, people emerging from the horrors of World War II and trying to forge a path forward for future generations not to ever have to go back to that, you know, just level of atrocity and barbarism. And look, the world has been not perfectly peaceful, but it's certainly, you know, not even close to perfectly peaceful, but it's certainly not as much war as like World War II, right? It's like, it's a different, like, we haven't had that yet. We hope we don't have to go back to that. can we build towards better peace? You know, it's like justice, they say, is a road that you walk, you don't get there overnight. So to my mind, it's like remembering the revolutionary romanticism of democracy. Like in the United States, people hear the word democracy and their eyes glaze over. You know, that's definitely not how it was back in the revolutionary period. But everyone points out, oh, they had slave holders were fighting that revolution for their own benefit. And I think that's kind of the challenge. It's like, even so, like even with those origins, even with that starting point, the fight for justice in what was created as the democracy of the United States of America expanded the voting rights, expanded the civil rights. And no, did it ever achieve perfection? No, but it's a road that we're walking. And we step into that stream of prior activism and we try to sort of grow it towards the future. And so I think respecting and looking backwards at some of these efforts of our ancestors and saying, hey, this is something that we're lifting up as like the foundation of what could be the Earth Charter could, you know, become something that is universally understood and acted on. And I know people have tried that. I know it's been brought around the world. I know there's been critiques of it. I know it's like on an intellectual level, it's been looked at. I guess what I'm saying is like at some core level, it's like we need to know what we're about. Like our fundamental values need to be put before us and we need to buy in. And then folks all around the world can do their own work towards that same common vision of humanity surviving, right? It's like, so you pick it up in your corner of the world the way it makes sense in your corner of the world. But you can talk about the fact that you're in solidarity with people in other parts of the world and you know how to reference them and you know what flag to wave to show that you're in solidarity. And you know, if it's not the Earth Charter, like what document you point to that like has collective buy-in, like it becomes something bigger than its component pieces, I guess. So that's like a global citizens movement. And then in terms of like, how do we help that come about or where do we plug in as individuals? Like, I think you just got to do what you love. I think that old quote, like, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs are more men and women who've come fully alive. Like, I think the times right now shut a lot of people down. And, you know, a lot of folks are taking antidepressants or watching too much TV or smoking pot and drinking or whatever we do to sort of numb ourselves down and not feel the pain of the world. And the pain's only intensifying. So we got to work on coming alive. And when you come alive, like you respond to the need that's present in your community and your family. When you respond to that need, then you align with the regenerative forces of nature. And nature's capacity to regenerate the web of life is truly astounding. And we just have to sort of like step into that and say, seek with our hearts to be a part of that. And some people do that on a policy level, which is great and important. And some people will do that on a grassroots level, which is great. That's important. And some people will do that on the front lines, which is great. That's important. And some people will do that on the visionary, like thought pieces. I mean, all of it matters. And I don't know where individually you can make the best impact. I mean, that's my own quest in my life. Like I'm still working on that.
Yeah. And there are millions and millions of ways to help the world improve. I mean, it's just astounding how many things are needed, but that those are all opportunities to help and feel plugged in and important in whatever it is. I mean, you know, it doesn't have to be like these big policy issues. You don't have to be an activist or whatever. I mean, hell, be a janitor. That's incredibly important. I mean, a business is going to close if you don't have a janitor. You know, like there's so many ways to be of importance in the world. But, you know, maybe we can develop this culture where people know that they're part of something, that there's millions of people doing their different things, but they're all headed in a similar direction. So I hope the fingers are crossed. So
well, I think it's also like a core need to belong. Like I think in a perverse way, that's why Trumpism works so well in America, is it takes people who are alienated and atomized and feeling overlooked and disregarded and disgraced, and it brings them together in giant arenas where they listen to classic rock music from their childhoods, and they get to sort of like have fun and eat good food and feel like they're not alone. And all of a sudden, they're invited to like wear the red hat and wave the Make America Great Again flag, and they feel like they're part of something, and they matter again, and they belong, and they're recognized, and other people's stories resonate with their stories, and it generates a very positive sense of camaraderie, even as it orients itself towards building a wall and locking some people out. I mean, that's the trick of, the Tellus Institute taught me this. Like, fascism in Europe was connected to the whole localism. And, the small is beautiful local economy is not inherently an anti-fascist thing. And so if you're really trying to like put it all together, like you want the peace, the sustainability, and the justice, like it's a hard puzzle to assemble.
Yeah, well, and it's all in some ways the same thing. These things are all interconnected. So there's these issues that have been seen as moral issues like forever, like justice or fairness. And people have fought about these things for thousands of years. But now we're at this point of existential risk in the world where everything's going to go down the tubes for everyone unless we learn how to treat each other fairly or to share resources. Like if we let people remain poor in parts of the world, they're not going to be able to fight off a pandemic that's a shared thing, or they're not going to be able to afford solar panels to deal with the climate, Like these things just have to get dealt with, or else it's going to hurt all of us. So hopefully we'll be at a new point where people are open-minded to bigger solutions than they have been before. I hope.
Well, I think one of the things about the scenarios studies is like in a time of crisis, that we talk about like systems have stability and homeostasis, right? That's what kind of like they self-regulate. They get perturbed, but they sort of come back. It's like your own body, you get a fever, but then you come back after you fight off the bug. So systems stay steady in homeostasis. And then when it gets knocked out of homeostasis, it goes through a rapid transformation. It's like this S curve, and it sort of goes up that S curve and finds a new homeostasis point. And that rapid transformation is chaos. It's just a lot happening at once before it can settle on a new. So that's sort of the moment we're in right now, is like the old system is absolutely getting destabilized, but the set point, like the new system, it could be a barren, lifeless world. That's definitely within the realm of possibility. I laugh because it's like, it feels a little bit outside what's probably going to happen, but it could be a world without humans. It definitely could be a world without civilization. Like the set point is like variable and will depend on what we do. And I think when we find ourselves faced with the fact that like the decision we're going to make in the next 10 years, 20 years is going to shape the future for humanity for generations to come, like that new set point is going to be established. Like we're setting the trajectory. Who asked for that? Who wants that? Like if you really open your heart and your eyes to that reality, it's like, it's kind of like being Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. Like he didn't want to carry the ring to Mount Doom and throw it in the volcano, but like someone's got to do it. It's like prior generations, they didn't want to stand up and have to fight, but they did, for us to have the freedoms that we have. So it's like now it's our turn for our children and our grandchildren. And if we take on this mantle of responsibility, I think the first feeling is just probably overwhelming shame and grief. And like, who wants to pass through that gate?
Right. Yeah. But I think all of us, though, in our lifetime will have very difficult emotions about the state of the world, whether we're paying attention now or not. I mean, we could ignore those feelings now, or we could feel like shit because we lost our home in a hurricane or a fire or the economy collapsed, or like we're in a time of rapid change. It's just going to change rapidly whether we decide to take charge of it or let it fall apart into chaos. So it's like we might as well deal with our feelings now and then try to do something about it, or else we're going to have more feelings later as everything falls apart. So it is, I think, important for people to find ways to manage their emotions around these big issues instead of avoiding them.
Or I think like the thought that has come to me in my own journey around this, because I think I carry a lot of grief for the world. And I feel like it's important to bear witness. Like as we watch the rates of biodiversity, the rates of extinction are going up, right? And as we watch animals that I grew up loving and believing in and seeing like an endless, infinite nature, like and watching it become finite and watching and grieving the loss forever of species that, my children will only see in books, right? Or on TV from old film, but like are not really in the world anymore. Like that to me has been I often think about the mountain gorilla every time I use my cell phone. It's like in order to get the rare earth minerals, we are reducing the mountain gorilla population through mountaintop removal and mining, and there's only 500 of them left on Earth. And yet they are such a powerful archetype for me personally in my life. Like I fell in love with primates at a young age and got really involved and thought one day I might even be a primatologist. Like there's a whole other side of my life that was looking at behavioral ecology and really in a scientific way. So anyway, it's just, I think my insight for me around that is I needed to be given permission to be my whole self and to have space where that wild energy that is grief, which is all the feelings that come with loss, anger and shame and fear, absolute terror, like all those feelings have a wild energy. And when you really embrace that wildness, it's a two-edged sword, because the pain is actually, and the despair I've discovered is actually hits a floor. And when you do it with other people and you all hit that floor together, there's nowhere else to go but up. And you start talking about gratitude, and you find within yourself joy and aliveness. And some of the numbing down that I had to do to survive my childhood, it's like, whoa, it's nice to be feeling again, even though it was, it's double-edged. It's a feeling that stabs, but it's so joyful too. And I think that wildness, that animal aspect of ourselves that civilization has tried to control and tamp down and harness towards the means of production and all that sort of stuff, the way we were trained to sit at a desk and keep our legs still and all the stuff that we do to sort of like become an adult in today's world. Like we need space to grieve. We need space to be wild. We need to invite wild energy into our lives. I think, festivals, football games, like these are moments, but like we need to do it in ritualized and connected ways. And I think that's what a large part of like healing is, and coming alive with nature. Like if we're going to realign with nature, we need to allow ourselves to remember who we really are as human beings, and redefine civilization towards human needs. Like right now, as a young parent, I just was blown away when my children were first born, and there's like no support. Like no one understands. No one at work is like, oh, you got young kids in the house, of course you're not showing up the way you used to. Right. Everyone just keeps doing it. It's like, yeah, I know. Crazy.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, life is messy and complicated. When a moment ago when you're talking about the various emotions that can happen around doing this work and really facing what's happening in the world, it makes me think about my own process this last couple of years of really pursuing my mission and digging into some work that I used to be afraid of doing. But now I'm doing. There's a show, and now there's some additional stuff I'll be doing related to this. And it sparks so many emotions in me. Like I feel joy and happiness to be doing work that I love, but it also terrifies the shit out of me to be facing these horrendous issues in the world that are so scary. And every day I dig around in the muck of the dark side of humanity, but yet it feels right, and I'm grateful to be doing it. So I swear I feel the whole spectrum of emotions all the time, which makes me feel more alive than ever. Like,
Yeah.
really, I have finally woken up and I'm fully alive. And I welcome anyone to just join me here. Life is better when you really just face it, deal with it, feel it, just do it, and embrace all the emotions that come. That is aliveness in a way that I didn't even know was possible until recently. So, I don't
I
know.
think for me, it's been crucial to do it with other people and not to do that alone. I think that's been like the missing ingredient. And that means like, I think there are safe containers. I mean, I think there's reasons why we hide ourselves, because the world's not always a safe place and we have been hurt. And like, it's some of that's self-protection is totally important to honor, and, not just take the armor off any old spot, like in the middle of the street. You do get arrested, right? But like, there are containers where it's permitted, welcome, safe. And I found them in professional circles. I found them in personal circles, in different ways. And I think that's the thing, is like, we just need more such spaces, and we need more recognition of the fullness of the human experience. And, the other thought, I'm going to go back to the question you asked a while back there, like leverage points. Like, I think moving from despair into action is a leverage point. Like, a lot of folks feel that sense. I mean, we've all been taught, like, since I was a young kid watching TV, and everything on TV is like, you're a consumer. And then you go to school and they say, the American consumer. And we're all like, we're the consumers, and the consumer's always right. And like, it's a passive, uncreative role, right? So it's like, and then we're stuck in this economic treadmill that makes coming together in community feel onerous and burdensome, and like extra meetings and more to do. And I'm just exhausted as it is. And, if I'm so lucky to have the freedom to go to extra meetings and not be working, multiple jobs. But the whole point is like, it's a treadmill for a lot of people, no matter where they are in the spectrum. And I think if we're going to overcome that and like shift, we got to believe in the goodness of that. There's a lot of chore and conflict and negotiating egos with people. So I think there's a part of our culture which is atomized because it's safer. We can just retreat behind our closed doors and buy our groceries online. Like, the whole thing is like, you don't have to interact. And so at some level that meets a need, because people are complicated and hard a lot of the time. But at another level, that atomization is soul sucking, because we're naturally social animals that need to be in relationships that are reciprocal and caring. So like, we're craving it even as we're avoiding it. So we have alienation, atomization, and now polarization on top of it, where it's just like everyone's screaming at each other at Thanksgiving because they're on different sides of the spectrum, or they're screaming at each other online, or wherever you look, they're screaming at each other. And so it's like, it exacerbates that feeling that humanity is just not worth saving. And it exacerbates that sense of self-hate, which is ultimately like, that's like, if humanity was one human being on Earth right now, it's almost like we're a suicidal teenager that's cutting herself. And we need to like figure out a way to love ourselves if we're going to survive. Like, we got to find the beauty in community again. And we got to exercise that atrophied democracy muscle. And we got to get out there and move from despair into action together. And in that collective action, we'll find solidarity and power, and we'll find hope. I think that to me is like the other really critical thing. People have to feel called off their couches and out from behind their TV sets and their screens and everything. And like, it's like shouting at each other on the Twitter sphere is like not real action, right? Like, we got to get out there and, and I think that's what brought me to the Food Forest Coalition. It's like, that work is in the dirt. We're planting trees, we're sequestering carbon, we're restoring soil, we're listening to nature, we're finding out what's going to grow in this changing climate. We're learning about the seasonalities, we're noticing the seasons, we're taking out our journals and we're keeping farm journal notebooks about what's been growing and what hasn't and why. We're watching how the insects and the pests interact with each other. We're learning the names of these plants and insects and things that were around us our whole lives that we never bothered to stop and notice because we're so obsessed with Coca-Cola or whatever it was. And so like, now it's like, oh, we're in that action. We're doing the work of reconnecting with each other and relearning who we are in relationship to nature, and planting trees that are going to bear fruits 10 years from now, 15 years from now. So really thinking about the future and literally planting seeds of hope. And that to me is like, it's just a starting point. Really, it's just an invitation in, but it becomes fertile soil for the movement. It becomes a way of regenerating and helping support local leadership and bringing people into relationship with each other that, when it's happened and done well, has been truly joyful, has been explosively joyful. But of course, humans are complicated. It doesn't always get there. There's conflicts, there's bumps in the road and obstacles. And so part of it is just the commitment to show up day after day and say, we're here and we want to do better than we did the day before, and especially when you're trying to bridge across urban divides of language and culture and class and race. Like no one's figured out how to do that. People have been struggling at it for decades. So it's like, if you're going to show up and do that work,
try.
Right. It's like, but if you're going to show up and do that work, you better be prepared for it to be hard too. It's like, exhausting, draining.
Yeah.
Not always. Yeah. There's also these explosive moments of joy where it's like, wow, it really can happen. It's like, that's what we're looking for, more of that.
Yeah. So we've started to get into the Boston Food Forest effort, and I'd love to hear about how this transition happened for you. So you used to work on all these big international global issues, and then here you are locally, and you started this organization from scratch, I understand. What was going on for you at the time, and what led you in this direction?
Yeah, I was actually making a transition from my work with the Tellus Institute to working with Chuck Collins at the Institute for Policy Studies. And Chuck is a well-known author on the topic of extreme inequality in the United States, and really has been an advocate for progressive taxation and other big liberal ideas that have been sidelined, as the country has turned right. So when I first met Chuck, I was still at the Tellus Institute working on the Great Transition Initiative. And we started talking about the frame of what would it take to build a new economy rooted in values of sustainability and racial justice and taking care of each other. Like, what would such an economy look like? And the Institute for Policy Studies, along with several other organizations at that time, were talking about the elements of a new economy existing through prior ways of activism, when Chuck himself had been very involved in the community land trust movement, which actually Bernie Sanders was fairly involved in over there as mayor of Burlington, and a whole bunch of other people. And Chuck, as a young man, had gotten involved in helping literally implement that model, like build it from scratch with those folks. And, community land trust.
I'm sorry, what is a community land trust?
Yeah, a community land trust really is a concept that arose in the struggle for civil rights and helping Black farmers have access to land ownership. And then, sort of a classic land trust is a land conservation mechanism. It holds the land in trust of future generations. A community land trust is the concept of you're holding it in trust of the community. And so in an urban context, it's really, I would say 99% of all community land trusts are housing land trusts, where they're building permanently affordable housing. And that has a certain economic model because you collect revenue through real estate transactions and rents and lease fees. And so there's a certain way where it self-perpetuates and self-regenerates. And it's long-term. And so people really like that as a long-term model of affordable housing. And Bernie Sanders really helped pioneer that movement. And Chuck Collins really worked bringing those community land trusts to like trailer parks in rural Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and helping people own the land, right, as a collective, as a community. So that was kind of always a progressive idea. Other progressive cool ideas within this vein are like worker-owned and operated businesses. The notion that like we live in a democracy. Why should the place where we spend 90% of our life, our place of business, be an autocracy? Like, does it really make sense to have like one person be king, which is basically what private ownership makes? And at some level, we're all creating value in the organization, so we should all own a part of the organization. So to the extent that that's true, worker owners have been, and worker-owned ownership models have been really exciting and have flourished at different moments. And there's other examples of like cooperative banking or credit unions, or just, there's like lots of examples of these pieces that people have innovated and pioneered in the struggle for survival and the struggle for justice, often originating in marginalized communities who didn't have other options and needed to pool their capital or their resources. And so you get these innovations that happen. So the Community Land Trust really emerges out of this whole new economy thinking at the Institute for Policy Studies, but it has this long, rich history to it. And I think at the time, I was getting really excited about the idea of, could you create an integrated system of a community-owned bank, community-owned land, and community-owned housing, and have them be in relationship with each other in a symbiotic, mutually supportive way. So fairly abstract concept. And as I started to think about any piece of that, I got drawn more and more into this idea of a community land trust. And I remember I was at a community meeting that we were facilitating as part of JPNet, which was a local initiative in the Jamaica Plain neighborhood of Boston, to say, what would it take to take the idea of a new economy transition, a big abstract idea from the Institute for Policy Study, and make it directly relevant to the lived experience of a diverse urban neighborhood like Jamaica Plain. And we started talking about like all the different pieces of that. And we realized that we were in some ways reinventing the transition town model. So we started to affiliate with the Transition Town Initiative, which started over in England. But we were different than the transition town model, different, but so we're all transition towns ultimately. Like, it was all like aspects of one idea. And then we started to form a regional network called the New England New Economy Transition, just really trying to understand, like, what does it take to build resilience and regional networks and local economy networks that are resilient as the world gets shaken up. And in those conversations, like, local leaders stepped forward with their vision and their ideas, and we created farmers markets, and we pioneered a local currency, and we transformed a dry cleaner into a wet cleaner, removing cancerous chemicals from the neighborhood. And we did a State of the Neighborhood Forum, an annual event bringing together the local city councilors and city nonprofit leadership and neighbors into a conversation about what we can do to help our neighborhood adapt in the face of coming challenges. And we did all sorts of projects. And one of them was the food forest. And it was a bunch of neighbors that came together, and they were doing different guerrilla gardening projects, or they had chickens illegally in their backyard, or, there was like a range of different innovations around urban agriculture, and they were enthusiastic about food. And it was like, I just remember being at these meetings, and like the food table would be mobbed. Like, more people would go to that discussion than any of the other discussions happening in the auditorium. And there was a food forest in the news at that time because it was being built over in Seattle, on Beacon Hill in Seattle. They built a food forest, and that was getting national publicity. And so folks in Boston were like, we got to do one too. We got to show up. We got to represent. And these two vets who had been, one had been in Afghanistan and one was retired from the Coast Guard. They had actually taken the concept around to Boston area nonprofits and got a lot of endorsements. And they stood up at a community meeting. They said, we don't have energy to carry this idea forward, but we want to offer it to anyone who's interested. And that's when a whole bunch of neighbors crowded around and wanted to meet again. And my job at the time was to help be the backbone for those meetings and help convene them and find the space and just really follow the leadership where it wanted to go. And so I remember they ultimately settled on the name Boston Food Forest Coalition. Like, that was a long conversation. And in between that, moments of conversation, they were going and they were gleaning apples from legacy apple trees that had long been planted in parks and yards throughout Boston. And they were learning about the existing fruit orchard that already here is in Boston. And they came up with the vision that a food forest in Boston shouldn't just be in one place. It shouldn't just be like the Beacon Hill Food Forest in Seattle. It should be all of Boston is the food forest. So what they really wanted was to connect these atomized spaces and neglected and forgotten trees with new intentional permaculture gardening and ecological agriculture, and really share and create a community of practice and invite neighbors into that. And they just started doing it. They started leading workshops. They approached the Boston Nature Center, Mass Audubon's urban wildlife sanctuary here in Boston. And the Boston Nature Center said, okay, you can use our space for like additional office space and educational space. You don't have to rent the rooms. And here's an acre of land to transform into an educational food forest, and you don't have to complete it. I understand it's a forever work in progress because you're doing and running workshops out of it. And so that just launched. And then at a certain point, we did garden raisings where we would go to people's private yards and in an afternoon pound out a new permaculture garden, like an old-fashioned barn raising, only it was taking what was like barren lawn and transforming it with native perennials and plants that are good for the pollinators and the birds, but also are food producing, like raspberries and blueberries and apple trees and peaches and other things that people want in their yards. And so it was fun, and people would learn by doing, and they would like learn about all sorts of aspects of that, how to plant a tree, how to prune a tree, what these different plants are and their various ecological uses and their various medicinal uses for humans. And it's just a lot of fun. And it's like a little switch goes off in your head when you're like, oh, let's go do a collective work day in so-and-so's backyard. You're like, that doesn't necessarily sound like it'd be as much fun as it really is. It's like you have to be there, sweat, and then look back and say, wow, look what we did together. And a pro-social switch that you didn't even know is in your primal brain gets flipped, and it's like you get flooded with endorphins, and it's fun because we like to work together. It's what our ancestors did. So that became what they did. And then the key leaders, one of them had to step back for personal reasons. She was having her first child and she needed to focus on her core business. This wasn't paid work. This was all volunteer work. And other people didn't have the ability to like quit their job and step into the leadership role. And it had grown to a point where it needed to emerge out from under the umbrella of JPNet and IPS. And the need for like land ownership had become apparent as some of these spaces were threatened by development pressure. It's like, if it's going to stay an open community food forest, we have to put it into like a land trust or some way, protect it from development. And we did at that time go around and talk to like lots of different existing nonprofits. Boston Natural Areas Network was one, trustees of reservations. There's a whole bunch that we spoke to. Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which was a land trust or is a land trust in a particular section of Roxbury. Just there was nobody who wanted to take on these small spaces and this vision. Everyone was like, we're busy with what we're already doing. That's outside our scope of our mission. Or like Boston Natural Areas Network actually ended up folding and getting absorbed by trustees. So they're going through a massive upheaval, So we decided we needed our own nonprofit community land trust. And I left my job at the Institute for Policy Studies and I stepped in as the unpaid executive director to incorporate the organization. And we took the existing steering team that had been leading it as a volunteer group, and that became the first board of directors. And we, just started meeting more and more neighbors who were doing this work, and we're happy and grateful that now there was a tool to support it being permanent and that they could interface with the city and we could get access to resources. And so it's been grassroots from the beginning, and it's been growing largely through in-reach. Like, we're not out there proselytizing so much as people are knocking on our door and saying, can you help us out? Like, we're talking to neighbors right now in Lower Roxbury about a parkland that they created a long time ago and already has fruit trees in it. And it's, that's why we're here. So we're in conversations to see if that's a good fit. It's just like, that's how we've been expanding and growing. And I think the most encouraging part of that, in an interesting way, is like, as the crisis of Earth deepens, as we feel the climate emergency increasingly in our neighborhoods, and we have like the hottest, wettest season on record here in Boston, and the most vulnerable, the elderly especially, suffered, and you have that reality, people want to get involved, they want to do something, and here we are already doing something, and there's just an increase of interest in what we're doing, and more volunteers knocking on our doors. And what we need to do is find the resources to hire enough staff that we can basically harness that energy and really be effective in absorbing that volunteer energy, because we're teeny tiny right now and we're all working, more than one person's job, and we're not being paid very well. So it's like the whole thing is like, it's a brilliant effort that has grown, from no budget to a much more substantial budget, and largely with support from the city of Boston. So it's a moment of like grassroots initiative meeting top-down funding from the city. And that handshake has been pretty firm. Like the city loves what we're doing and wants to support it, gives us the land for a nominal fee, is bringing even more resources to this as COVID crisis has deepened. So it's been interesting how that's happened. So that's sort of like the moment we're in. Like we're literally at this cusp of like where we could be very successful and move forward and build a land trust that's here in perpetuity, and really is a gift to future generations, and for all of Boston and even greater Boston.
Yeah. The whole thing sounds amazing. I mean, what I'm thinking about at the moment is just that in cities, especially in some struggling neighborhoods, properties will go abandoned or dormant and just look shitty for years. Like, why not make it vibrant and full of plants and feed people? It's like, it kind of mystifies me sometimes in city environments how properties will just get ignored for years.
Totally.
Who wants that,
Well,
So,
some of it does happen. I mean, that's what I've been, inspired by, is the fact that like a lot of these spaces long predate the Boston Food Forest Coalition. Like these neighbors have been coming together since the 70s and 80s and 90s in Boston, and they have been beautifying. And like the Leland Cooperative Garden up the street from where I'm living now was created, I think, in the 80s and 90s. And it was like a trash-strewn, vacant, neglected city lot with hypodermic needles and, tires and TVs. And the neighbors came together to clean it up, and they started planting trees, and they started putting in grow beds, and then they got a little bit of funding here and a little bit of funding there, and they were moving plants from their own yards over there, and they were learning as they went about gardening and teaching each other, and then having potlucks in the winter, and brunches on Sundays, and reading books together. Like it became a whole, and they still are here. And here they are decades later, and they had, like during COVID, a lot of cultural events, so people could be socially distanced but not isolated, and come out and sit in the outdoors, which is apparently relatively safe, and listen to music. Or they just did a timber framing workshop. And the Leland Cooperative Garden, approached us and said, we heard about the Boston Food Forest Coalition. We feel like finally there's a place for us. Like you guys embody who we've always felt we were. And as I've been, doing this work, more and more neighbors like that of a prior generation of activists have shown up, and they have stories, some of which are battle scars and wounds, which have left a lot of cynicism and pain, and some of which are victories. And it's useful to remember that, like that's been part of the intention. Like I just was talking to a group called Dorchester Gardenlands Preserves, which got 5 different plots and transformed them into community gardens back in the 70s and 80s. And they haven't been that active really since then, but they still exist. So I didn't even know they were like still in existence. There's just a large range of different groups, like these folks in Lower Roxbury who are talking about the Frederick Douglass Peace Garden that they built together, through community initiative. So part of it is like, wow, like this is a service that's been needed and continues to, as I say, to intensify. Like more and more people are interested in gardening. More and more people are interested in native plants and understanding the threat that invasives are to the wildlife and the birds and the bees that we love so much. And so like it's an increasing desire in growing food locally. It's not, more and more people are saying it's not about calories. It's about healthy food and healthy food choices and accessible healthy food, that's not overly priced. Well, what better way to get a pint of raspberries than to pick it in the food forest growing next door to your house? That's sort of the gift of these spaces. And so I think that's and then you layer into that just rainwater capture, right? So the rainwater runoff is a big problem in most cities. Here we're capturing it on site. It infiltrates into the soil. Carbon sequestration, and even like the intangibles, like we don't know 100% why flowers and trees prevent violence in city neighborhoods, but we absolutely understand that that's a true thing. Like urban planning schools, you study that correlation, and the causation is a bit mysterious, except that there's also all these psychological studies saying that even just an image of a tree reduces stress and cortisone levels in the human body. So it's like, it's primal. Like we like having trees and flowers around, and it helps us be more peaceful and kind to each other. And kids who grow up with regular and consistent access to green space, it mitigates long-term adverse mental health outcomes, which is a big issue in urban youth. So, and they've shown that urban youth who have access to safe green spaces do better in the long term. Like it's a very peaceful intervention that has potentially long-term impacts.
Yeah. Well, and part of what excites me about your work is that it's helping people in cities be connected to nature. And one of the things I've been concerned about is that humanity around the world is becoming more urbanized. That's just the trend. More people live in cities than ever. But sometimes cities have been devoid of nature. And here we are now where across the world, nature is being destroyed left and right, and people are not standing up for it. There's not adequate public policies to protect it. People are not enough people clamoring to save nature. And I think it's part of this urbanization where people just feel disconnected from the living world. And so with efforts like what you're describing, when you can get people actually with plants and with animals and touching things and being with nature, they're probably more willing to stand up for it and be a citizen around that and push for good policies and all the stuff we need to everybody save nature.
Yeah, I think that's been shown. I think it does. There have been some studies that show that students with more access to nature, there's less bullying. There's a certain way where remembering our connection to creation, if you can put it that way, is important. It's like core to, again, it's like that animal. Like we're not, it's not to say that what humans do is unnatural, because just in the same way a termite builds a giant termite mound, right? And it's like this huge structure. Like humans, we build cathedrals. We do these things because it's part of our animal instinct and our nature as well. Like we are natural beings, but we can do it in a way that respects ourselves as part of that web of life, and we can do it in a way that's regenerative and feeds the regenerative web of life. And right now we have a life-destroying civilization. We're literally killing ourselves and destroying the web of life and eliminating species forever from Earth, and making it uninhabitable for our children. Like it's literally a life-destroying civilization. And it doesn't have to be. It could be a life-sustaining civilization. It could be a regenerative. Like imagine if everybody's job when you woke up in the morning and you went to work every day wasn't like to destroy and extract more, but was to help regenerate. And why not? Why couldn't we structure such an economy where people really do get a chance to do what feels joyful and meaningful and helpful? I mean, isn't that what the economy should be for? Instead of building weapons and repairing the damage of floods that could have been prevented, we should. I mean, it just feels like there's some perversity in the fact that so many people hate their work, and their work is so destructive and soul sucking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know.
It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. Taking that concept maybe a step further is I've had this vision of our cities, even our dense downtown areas where you've got the big concrete skyscrapers and office buildings and whatever. Why can't we cover them in plants? I mean, like creeping ivy on all buildings, or, every apartment building has, a garden box on the balcony, or even office buildings, you can open the window and there's plants right there. You could put plants everywhere if you were intentional about it. And we could make even around malls.
I think that's absolutely true. There's so many more
a concrete shit show.
We know.
Yeah. I would love to see more.
Another thing we could do is in Boston, we've the Army Corps of Engineers put a lot of the streams under the ground into culverts and tunnels, and so we don't even know we're driving over these streams. And yet the foundations of buildings built near these spaces, they just go through chronic disrepair because they're harder to maintain because it's not real. The ground is actually over stream. So it's like, why not just let those buildings collapse where they don't want to be, build higher density in other parts of the city, and resurface those streams and bring that riparian nature back to life and plant around the borders to prevent flooding and make those borders beautiful parks and food forests that permeate through our city. I mean, we can imagine it, and it's definitely technically feasible. And prior generations built all types of infrastructure, not necessarily always the best choices, with modernism and their assumptions about life. But like, now we know better. Let's make better choices and take the same resources, and before it's too late, and start. And as you're pointing out, like, more and more humans are going to live in cities. So let's make cities really livable. Let's recognize that quality of life. It's not just affordable housing. It's the same thing for the businesses. The businesses get gentrified. The local businesses get moved out. Like, these businesses are the hotbed of community. People know each other through these interactions at these businesses. It's not just like a place to make money. It's like, this is like where community comes alive. So if we need the affordable housing, we need the affordable local businesses, and we need the open space and the access to nature that's primal to our human beingness. And I think looking at like how old villages were structured, and like for architectural inspiration, like there's movements around that. Richard Register is an architect at the University of Berkeley, I believe, who wrote a lot about eco-cities and adaptation of cities to be more ecological. And some of his stuff is cute, with bicycle bridges between buildings, but a lot of it's very innovative and very policy and analytical and still applicable. Like he talks about transferable development rights. So where new developments are constantly looking for zoning variances in order to make somebody a lot of money, link those zoning variances to helping build and resurface some of these streams and do some of this work that's necessary. And then slowly over time, developers will help pay for the transformation of cities. And you'll get your tallest skyscrapers in certain areas and your more riparian permeated neighborhoods in other areas. And I think one of the challenges is actually, if you go and you have a big community meeting and you say, what do you all want to see happen in this neighborhood? Everyone thinks in terms of the existing world, and they're like, we need more parking. It's literally what everyone always says.
Yeah. More concrete, please. Yeah, I know. But even then, you can make one parking garage for the neighborhood and let the rest of the land be free. I mean, there's ways to do that too, and still have nature. So, I mean, we have no shortage of technology. I mean, we've created an internet. You can buy anything on Amazon from around the world. We are trying to send people to Mars. I mean, there's no shortage of technological ability. We could apply it right here to allowing life to emerge in our cities. Why not? So,
yeah, I think that's exactly the point. It's like, especially when our backs are against the wall, we're incredibly innovative. So let's heave ho and get to it. I mean, like, I think part of the challenge is like, you have to sort of like, people go from complete denial and then they flip the needle all the way over to utter despair. And it's like, in between is where we have to stay. We have to be fluctuating around it in that liminal space of being alive, right? And feeling things and open ourselves to all the feelings. It's like, if we can do that, then maybe we can navigate an innovative solution. But we have to let ourselves feel. If we're just in denial, then we don't change anything about the world. And we don't acknowledge that, we have an obligation to our children to change things and start fixing things now. And I think that's like, for me, I have really young kids. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. And my feeling is like, okay, here's the world in crisis. This is what I'm giving you as your inheritance, but I also want to gift them at the same time. And here's my best efforts at solutions. And here's all my friends and family involved in that. And here's a way for you to sort of like take what we're giving you and make it better, because it's your world, ultimately.
Yeah. With these efforts you're doing, and let's just assume that they get ramped up and you get all the funding and staff you deserve to do the great work, and there's, the movement in general grows. I'm thinking about how much food we might be able to produce locally for people to eat as sort of even a national security issue, really, because we may have really difficult times ahead. And I think our current farm system has given us plenty of food over the years, but should not be taken for granted with climate change and pandemics and whatever else. I mean, I got thinking about food security so much during COVID-19 with all the lockdowns. When I went to grocery stores and half the shelves were empty, I'm like, oh shit, this food accessibility I've taken for granted my whole life really should not be taken for granted. So what you're doing is really adding a layer of security where if the current systems struggle, you can go out back and pick some apples or some berries or grow something in your yard or, have access to more food locally.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. There's a truth that we've all been experiencing, right? Which is we have this really efficient, globally integrated economy, including the food systems, and it's incredibly brittle. It's very efficient. It's good for on-demand restaurants where we sit down and we want to be able to eat exactly what's on the menu whenever we order it. And so we have a system that really does provide that and provides it relatively cheaply. So that's efficiency. But boy, is it brittle. It's like a little bit of a hiccup, and all of a sudden there's shortages and delays and things. I mean, it's like, and we're just at the beginning of the perturbances we're going to be experiencing with increasing, deepening climate change and what is definitely going to feel like a period of increasing global chaos. So it's scary because we're all of a sudden aware that, I'm plugged into this system, and if the system stops working, I don't really have another alternative. Like, where do I get my food? Or, and absolutely, like back in the day, even back in the 50s, it was a much more regional food economy, and you had different regions of the country specializing. But now so much comes from just like a few counties in California, and it gets trucked all over in refrigerated carts. So yeah, we got to rebalance.
And those California places are running out of water too. Like
exactly.
That California food may not continue. So sorry to interrupt, but
no, but that's exactly right. I mean, so we have to rebalance. I mean, it's like whether we choose to do it consciously and rapidly now, or whether we're like forced to do it out of necessity and panic later, like it has to happen. So people are aware of that. There are these conversations happening across New England, for example. There's an organization called Food Solutions New England, which has brought together the departments of agriculture from all the different states of New England, and not just the policymakers, but also everyone in the food system, from the producers and growers to the farm system workers and food service workers to the investors, to the restaurant owners. Like the whole farm to table spectrum has been consulted, and it's an ongoing process. And they created a New England food vision. And they asked the question, like, what would it take to produce 50% of our calories locally in New England by 2060? Like if that was the direction we wanted to achieve by 2060, what magnitude of change are we talking about? And they crunched the numbers, and they looked at the arable land in New England, and they looked at the rates of urban sprawl, and they looked at how much wildlands and woodlands you'd want to keep alive for other forms of nature, and not just cut it all down and go back to the clear-cut New England of yesteryear, which was its own type of ecological catastrophe. So they looked at all that stuff, and they ran the scenarios, and they said, what assumptions can we make about how we might be willing to change our diets? And so they had multiple different dietary assumptions, and that created different scenarios. And they talked about their population growth assumptions. I mean, they went through it like any rigorous scenario building process can do it. And they determined it's technically achievable, but we would have to definitely repurpose some suburban and urban land. It would be a sliver of the overall pie. So urban agriculture absolutely matters for this vision. We will have to train more people to become farmers and recruit more people to be farmers, which is a hard sell because it's a very hard row to hoe, so to speak. It's a lot of work, not a lot of remuneration, and not a lot of time off. So who wants the job?
And risky too.
And a lot of farmers in New England are like, I think the average age of a new farmer is like 60, something crazy like that. It's like people enter farming later in life because it's so expensive. How do you get access to the land? Like you leverage and go into debt just to get ownership of your farm in the first place. So like the whole thing needs a lot of subsidies, needs a lot of like living wage is a big part of the vision. If you really think it through logically, it's like it starts to connect to so many other changes that are needed. But it's the point is that people are talking about it. It's on the agenda. It's in the imagination. It's being, it's definitely not a mainstream conversation. It's definitely more of a policy conversation with various stakeholder groups, but it's out there. It's happening.
Yeah. I don't know if it's within your realm, but is there work being done to grow food indoors in, old warehouses or mills or factories that are abandoned using grow lights and such? Is that a viable option?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think especially when you think about urban agriculture, that's a very viable option. Especially if you can link those grow lights to solar panels and regenerative energy. I think you can get a lot that way. There's a whole debate between those people who believe in restoring the soil and natural systems and those people who are like super high tech and into hydroponics and chemical solutions. It looks like the food grown hydroponically is probably fine and adequate and tasty and safe, and it's not organic, but it's probably not bad for the world if it's done with renewable energy. So it's not a bad option for part of the puzzle, I don't think. Rooftop gardens, people are also exploring that and doing rooftop farming. That has a lot of obstacles, just technical things about load weights that, when you put soil on top of a roof that's already engineered, so you're sort of retrofitting it some are more easy to retrofit than others. And then you have, all the challenges of farming. It's just like, there's a lot of labor involved. And I think, but one of the things that roofs offer is large flat areas when you can find it. I think that's one of the challenges of traditional farming in a city is large flat areas and contiguous plots of land. So you're not like driving from plot to plot to plot and spending all your time in traffic as you're trying to bring your goods to market. So I think that's another thing that food forests offer as a solution, which is to say, not every aspect of urban agriculture needs to be a farm. There's other ways to do urban agriculture. Community gardens are another good example of urban agriculture, but people are growing, it's more like victory gardens. They're growing for their own families. And again, that also tends to be flat. And what food forests are more about is like, well, yeah, sure, have some of those raised beds and those boxed garden beds, but then put some fruit trees in there and have like a fruit vine going up it and like put in some understory shrubbery and think about like the 3 dimensions of the space, and some things grow well in the shade. So not everything has to have direct sunlight. And that's important because in the city, there's lots of buildings and other things that cast shade onto these lots. And so you can do more with good design on irregular city lots when you think like that. And it's not necessarily commercial growing, but it's still growing food and it's still feeding people. And it's also teaching people about their diets and food preservation and food harvesting and all that.
Yeah. How much food output are you guys able to pull off with these plots? And how do you determine who gets what? You'll have a bunch of neighbors sharing a project together. How much do you just split it equally between everybody who worked on it, or how much do you get and how do you figure out?
So the land trust doesn't have a set policy. The land trust really, just as it should be, it's like we're holding the land in trust, and the beneficiaries, the exclusive rights and users of this land, is the community. And that community is represented through these volunteer stewardship teams that do all the work. So they do the snow shoveling, the trash removal, the weeding, the pruning, the harvesting, they do it all. And it's all volunteer. So those volunteers get to decide where the fruits of their harvest go. And sometimes they take their share of apples or things that they love. Sometimes they have put it in brown bags and gone door to door to neighbors they know are needy and offer them food. Sometimes they've put it out on tables and with a sign that says, please take some, and let other people just sort of bag their groceries like a CSA might. Others have literally formed relationships with like Women's Lunch Place, which is a homeless shelter that feeds folks in downtown Boston. And so all the food grown at the Old West Church Food Forest goes to feed folks at Women's Lunch Place. Others have made partnerships with like elder service nonprofits like Rounding the Bases, which does cooking classes with the elderly. And so the food has gone there. Others have brought it to their churches and distributed it that way. So It's really, it really varies, and it can change as relationships change. And another thing that a lot of these sites do is they have an annual harvest festival. So before COVID, this was a more active part of what we did. Was a lot of community gatherings. These are not just farms. These are public parks. There's outdoor movie nights. There's open mic nights. There's Easter egg hunts and birthday parties. There's wake up the earth barbecues. There's, harvest festivals where we make apple cider at the end of the summer. I mean, there's face painting, and it just goes on and on, like what people have imaginatively made come alive in these spaces. And so that's a big part of it too. It's the culture, it's the connectivity, and then the food gets shared that way. And the food also gets shared with all visitors, and that includes non-human visitors. So animals get some of it, unless you put netting on some of your cherry trees and stuff, the animals get most of it. So it's like, you got to decide, and that's, again, it's up to the volunteers. This is their space. The land trust supports them. Basically, we provide technical assistance. We do training and fruit tree and fruit care maintenance, and we do training and group dynamics if they need it, or leadership or community outreach, or whatever they sort of need to sort of keep themselves going. We've helped them with grant writing. We do a lot of the design work early on. If there's like a technical expert that's needed because your peach tree has peach borer and you don't know what to do about it, like we find those technical experts, and we find the ones that are oriented towards permaculture and ecological principles and not towards chemical, sort of like pest control necessarily. But sometimes it's like a choice. It's like, if you want your winter moths to be addressed, you can either wait for nature to deal with it, or you can spray. And there's a trade-off both directions. So we're honest about that. But we ultimately let the stewards decide. It's their space.
Yeah. Are there efforts like this happening in a lot of places? Is there a whole network of these around the country or in other countries?
There are definitely food forests and community farms and all sorts of like urban orchards all over the country popping up. And the models really vary and are different. They're not all following our model of being part of a community land trust. Some are city-owned. Some are owned by nonprofits. Some are like what I said with Beacon Hill Food Forests in Seattle. It's like it's one project in one location. Some are, multiple projects. Some are happening in schoolyards and churchyards. I would say the food movement in the United States is alive and well. Like when Michelle Obama tore up part of the White House lawn to plant a garden, like it signaled at some level that there's a movement afoot. And I think it's still afoot and still growing. What we're doing is innovative in certain ways, like the combination of community ownership through the land trust, the combination of community stewardship through these volunteer teams, linking that with the relationships that we've been able to build with the city of Boston is fairly unique, I would say. But a lot of the story can be useful for other sister initiatives, and we're building out tools like everything from how do you know you have a healthy food forest and a dashboard to help the volunteers manage that, to like online resources you can find on our resource library at bostonfoodforest.org about how do you know what's a weed and what's a valuable perennial. Like there's a little video there you can watch to sort of, so we're just building out our tool library, and we're happy to begin. If we're successful in our fundraising and we get our full staff component, we'll be even more active in sharing that outwards and making connections on beyond Boston.
Yeah. For this whole movement to grow of creating local food opportunities, what's needed to grow the movement? I mean, do we need public policy? Do we need money? Do we need expertise? What do we need to make more of this in the world?
Yeah, I think we need that, all that. Definitely public policy matters. There's a time in the 40s, I think, where we really figured out a whole bunch of public supports for local family-owned farming. And then we dismantled those to centralize farming in the hands of large agribusiness. I mean, that was a public policy decision. And both systems depend on a lot of public subsidy. So it's just a matter of how we want to direct that subsidy. It's not like, do we need subsidy? I mean, we have it. We've always had it. Farming's always had it. So it's more like, who do we prioritize? The local family farmers or the large agribusiness? Now, again, the large agribusiness is great at the monocropping and the efficient system that we have that produces a lot of meat and a lot of other things that we really like. So it's not a simple transition, but it's also totally an unsustainable system. It's destroying the topsoil. I mean, we could go on and on. It's impoverishing people. It's, even as it's creating so many calories, we still have underfed, malnourished folks in our world. So it's like it's not even succeeding at its minimal job. So we need to change that industrial food system. And that is definitely going to be like the USDA Farm Bill. We have to change that. I mean, so public policy is huge in this. But I think also we just need to know, like we need education. We need people to be engaged with their food. It's surprising how many kids walk into a food farce and they say, I didn't know strawberries only grow this time of year. Or I didn't know that's how grapevines look and that's where grapes grow. I mean, it's like, yeah, we got to know this stuff. It's like you were saying earlier, like you got to be able to touch nature in order to be an advocate for nature. And so similarly, like if we're going to advocate for ecological agricultural principles to be carried out on a policy level, we sort of have to experience it in our lives at some level. And so having it locally is very important. And then definitely rebalancing towards local food production is crucial. And I think one of the interesting parts about that is if we have a sense of solidarity towards people in the world who are struggling with chronic water shortages, and we live in a really wet, moldy part of the world, how do we share our water with them? Well, it's through the food we grow. That's the best, most efficient way to share our water with them. So if we wanted to really orient ourselves towards that and be a space of regional abundance, we could be a beacon onto the world. We could be a source of inspiration, and others could, benefit from that and be inspired and learn from our example. And I think there's a lot to be said for that right now, because I think hopelessness is the enemy of justice, as Brian Stevenson said. It's like hopelessness is like the whole zombie fascination in our culture. Like there's a sort of zombification of our sense of the future. It's like, oh, it's only doom and gloom. Well, if that's really our image, we're calling it into existence because the future is, again, not someplace we're going. It's something we get to create.
Yeah. That idea about New England being so rich in water, I've thought about before and felt grateful for it. I live in Massachusetts, but I never really thought until now about how this area should be a food exporter to the world. It should not be California in the middle of a desert,
I mean, I think that's a good question, actually. It's not, I wouldn't say that's a conclusion. The Food Solutions New England, they looked at like, we have rocky, acidic soil. We'll never produce enough grain to feed ourselves. We'll always need to like import grain. Clearly we can't grow bananas and are unlikely to ever be able to grow bananas or coffee beans well here. So there's things that we're going to want. On the other hand, we're really well suited for dairy production and meat production. I mean, there's a reason why Vermont has specialized in dairy, and our rocky terrains and pasture-fed meat and grass-fed meat could really be produced well here. And there's other things that do well in New England. So if we specialize in what we do well, and we diversify like the garden vegetables, because a lot of the sort of like nutrient-rich foods that we like in our salad, we could all grow nearby and close by. So
yeah. This whole conversation has been fascinating, and I've just been learning so much, and I'm so excited about it. I mean, because you're solving so many things at the same time. And I just appreciate your enthusiasm for it. I mean, I can tell you're just jazzed up and you're into it, which is really, it's awesome. I mean, I love that. I mean, we've spanned a whole bunch of different issues in this talk. Is there anything we missed or any sort of
I'm sure
lingering stuff on your mind?
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing that we maybe mentioned briefly was like racial justice. And I would say that that's a huge component of all of this. And it's a long conversation, but I think there's a lot to be said for, when I was a young man, I was involved very briefly as a 3-month intern in South Africa when the African National Congress had taken control of parliament in South Africa and was rewriting the Constitution. And I got to be an intern to Willie Hofmeyr, who was a member of the ANC. He was an activist who had been in jail during the anti-apartheid struggle. He'd never expected to find himself in parliament. He was trying to run his little member of parliament office, and I showed up as like a very young man, and I helped him organize his files, and he sent me off to meetings to take notes on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was getting formed, and keeping him involved in that process and updating him and writing memos. And it was fun. It was a great summer for me, and it was very eye-opening about what reconciliation means with history, and how might we really engage in that process. So I think that's a big part of what needs to happen in the United States, and also just between the global north and the global south. Like, I don't think we're going to get from here to there by sweeping it all under the rug. I mean, and I don't think the current climate and the current conversation is that productive. So there's a lot to figure out around real reconciliation with history and what that means for repairing the harm done and restoring rights to people whose rights still to this day are under assault. And what does it mean to think about that as all process and part of this regeneration that we've been talking about? So as we regenerate the web of life, I think there's a whole racial justice component, climate justice component that needs to be explicit in the conversation. And there's just so much to talk about. So I'm sure that's just one of several things. I mean, there's other elements that we probably haven't touched on as well, but we could talk forever. As you can tell, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, we probably could, you know. But I mean, the racial thing you bring up is critically important. And I think it's, again, one of those issues where we've fought about it forever as a moral issue, but now it may be existential. I mean, you know, the global north versus global south. I mean, if we're going to let whole parts of the world remain poorer and struggling, and they just happen to be brown and black people, you know, maybe our racism is getting in the way of saving ourselves from these enormous global issues like climate and pandemics and loss of nature and whatever else. And it happens locally too. I mean, as you guys work in neighborhoods where brown and black people live, have historically been poorer than the rest of the population economically, you know, rebalancing that with nature and climate solutions and food, and it's all intertwined.
Well, also
for
ownership
sure.
of land. I mean, I think these are neighborhoods where people, just within recent memory, there's elder activists who've been alive and have tried again and again to get the city to respond to their needs in the neighborhood, or to own a park on behalf of the community, only to watch some nonprofit take it away from them, you know. And so there's battle scars and wounds that are real in a city like Boston that need to be addressed. And people need to have, I mean, community building happens at the speed of trust building, and that's slow. And then people retire, people die, people move away. But the speed of capital and the speed of real estate development is much faster.
Well, I could talk with you for many more hours, I'm sure, and hopefully I will at some point. But this has just been really fabulous, and I'm just so grateful to you for coming to share all of what you've been doing. So thank you for all this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's really been fun. I'm grateful to be part of this conversation with you. Appreciate the invitation to reflect on my global, local story, because I feel like you're right. It's like when one person, I'm torn, and it's great to try to weave these threads together. It's meaningful.
Yeah, and it is so obviously interconnected. I mean, I didn't quite realize until we had this conversation, but they really do fit together in interesting ways. They're not different. I mean, all these big international solutions we talk about, it's actually getting implemented on the ground in communities by real people. So it all fits.
Yeah, in permaculture, we often talk about how the soil is foundational, right? Like, you have to start any project with understanding your soil and regenerate. There's more species of life alive below the soil than above the soil. And so you have to get that going again. And like the dead, compacted, polluted soils of urban contexts, like, it needs a lot of work to jumpstart it, but once it gets going, nature regenerates. And then that becomes the foundation for all the beautiful stuff you want to grow in your garden.
Amen, brother. Keep it up. It's fabulous work. I just wish you all the best in all this.
Thank you, Shelby.
Yeah. And listeners, thank you for joining us. I'm glad that you've been with us for this conversation. And I just want to let you know that in the show notes for this, I'm going to link you to all of what we've talked about. Links to the Boston Food Forest Coalition, to the Tellus Initiative, and maybe some other things along the way I might link you to. So thank you, and we'll see you next time. And until then, let's try to be the best people we can be. Take care. Thanks for listening, but you're not done yet. We can't change the world if we keep the joy of saving the human race to ourselves. Help me spread the word and help this movement grow. Please subscribe to the show, both the podcast and the YouTube channel. Leave ratings or reviews, which encourages others to listen. Share this show with others on your social media. Even better, just tell a friend about it and have a good conversation about the state of the world. These things really make a difference. I hope you can help the show grow and reach a larger audience. I'm grateful for your help. Thank you. And please stay in touch with me. I love to get feedback, suggestions, and questions. Go to the website at joyofsavingthehumanrace.com. At the website, you'll learn more about the show, and you can sign up to get occasional email updates. Thanks to Moby for the show's theme music, and thanks to you for being here. All right, we're done for today. Be well. I'll talk to you soon.